to family separation policies at the border. So we really appreciate you taking the time to come and join us. If you happen to be new to Holy Family, I think you're all Holy Family Christians. Anyway, just in case you're not sure who I am, my name is Cambria Tortorelli, and I'm the Parish Life Director of Holy Family and a member of the Social Concerns Committee. And social concerns and social justice and Catholic social teachings of the Church are very much a passion of mine. So we're thrilled to have Stephanie Delgado Garcia, who is a parishioner, join us tonight. And I'm going to be able to introduce you to her in just a few minutes more formally. But before we move to Monica with prayer, just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So if any of you who can still drink caffeinated coffee at this time of the day, there is some coffee in there, caffeinated with a buzz. So you'll have to just go in there and pour it. But the rest of the coffee is decaffeinated. Restrooms, that you probably know, are there. And so basically the format tonight is we're going to begin with prayer in a moment. Then I'll do a little bit of context setting about what we're doing tonight and why we're doing it. And then I'll introduce Stephanie. And then she will speak for about half an hour, talking about her experiences in Texas during the summer and making the connection with Catholic social teaching and with our scripture. And then we'll have a short opportunity for question and answer. So it's about 5 minutes. And then we're going to do something a little bit different that we don't normally have the privilege and opportunity to do in these kinds of presentations. Because we're very cognizant that often people want to have an opportunity to discuss some of what they've heard in a more dialogue kind of fashion. And so we're going to divide you up into small groups, and you'll have a facilitator at each table. And the facilitator, who we're all members of the Social Concerns Committee, will give you just a couple of guidelines, and then there's some questions that Stephanie has prepared for discussion at the tables. And so if everything goes according to plan, you should have about 25 minutes, I think, for some conversation at your table. Obviously, if the conversation dries up, we'll move on more quickly to the close of the program. But then you'll have another opportunity for more questions and answer if you so desire. And then we'll close with prayers. So that's kind of the shape of the evening. We anticipate that we'll be ending certainly no later than 8:30. But if you dry up with questions, you don't want to talk to each other anymore, then it'll be earlier than that. So that kind of depends on all of you. Don't not talk because you want to leave early. So you're here because you're passionate, you're interested, you want to learn more about some of the things that are happening with our immigrant families and children at the border. So let me turn it over to Monica Urquia, another member of the committee, and she will lead us in prayer.
That's decaf over there?
That is a decaf over there, yes.
And the regular is what?
And the regular is in that little room there to the right.
Okay.
Okay. And I wanted to say thank you to our committee and Mary Hannah in particular for making those delicious tiny little chocolate. Yes. So Mary.
Okay. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. And I'm going to ask all of you to do a little guided imagery prayer. Put your hands on the table, put your hands down, close your eyes. And just taking a deep breath, let it out, and know that the room is dark, but there's little tiny luminescent lights. Maybe you can see it, maybe you can't. And that is the essence of what Christ is. And we know that by his cross and resurrection, that we are there. And take those little lights and see all the hatred, all the anger, all the things that you just want to give to God in those little lights. Just see them emerging, being absorbed and disappearing, almost like water melting the evil and the sin and even the destruction, just anything you don't want. See it go into those little lights. And then know that by his cross and resurrection, as the cross enters the room, see the cross at first dark with a light going behind, and then see all those little lights absorbed into the cross as the cross grows with the love and wisdom that only Christ is. And then see a large burst of light, knowing that Christ is risen and that we are all here to welcome him and his Holy Spirit among us tonight. Amen.
Amen. So, as I said, tonight is being presented by our Social Concerns Ministry. And about a year or 15 months ago, we actually held two more or less back-to-back events. And some of you might have attended the immigration, we had a presentation on immigration and some of the issues that were prevalent at the time. And then a week or so after that, we had another event, which was an immigration workshop for people who are going through the immigration process, people who are trying to move from green card to citizen, or maybe who are in a state of limbo in terms of their visa status, and we were able to work with Congressman Judy Chu's office, thanks to the help and liaison of Marlene Moore, our Director of Community Services. And we had a number of nonprofit immigration lawyers who came and offered their services gratis for people to come and ask questions and have some consultation. And so when we met to begin to think about what we wanted to do this year, there are a lot of things happening. There's always a lot of things happening in our world that really call our attention to the social needs around us, and especially in our country. We debated about whether or not we wanted to do something on healthcare or perhaps on the death penalty, because you know some of the teaching on that has continued to evolve over the last few months. And Pope Francis has just stated that under no circumstances is the death penalty ever an acceptable situation. So that was something very attractive to kind of explore a little bit. But in the course of this meeting, Stephanie came and was part of our Social Concerns Ministry. And then we learned that she had actually, she's an immigration lawyer working with children, and that she had actually been on the border over the summer, and in fact just returned when we had this meeting at the end of July, early August. We thought, this is the Holy Spirit speaking. So we thought, of course, we need to do something on the issues of children who are separated from their families and some of the things that have been happening. So that's kind of the context in which we came up with this decision to focus on this particular topic. We're also very cognizant that there's a lot of information out there on the different social media outlets, on the TV channels, in newspapers, and a lot of it's conflicting. And so how do we know, as good Catholics who are trying to be faithful to the teachings of our church, what to believe? And so tonight we are presenting you with an understanding of this particular immigration situation through the lens of the Catholic Church. As I said, Stephanie's going to be connecting this back to Scripture, to the Catholic social teachings. And we also have some other handouts, which I think, again, if you want to get really through the lens of the Catholic Church, which is very thoughtful, incredibly thoughtful and studied on immigration, as on many, many issues. There's several handouts, that one on family detention, what does that mean? Things like, how much does it cost? Taxpayers, why are they, where are they being detained, those kinds of things. There's another one on separating families at the border, a costly practice. Frequently asked questions about catch and release and reunification of separated families. 3 common myths about refugees. And then perhaps most importantly of all, because there's so much misinformation about what the church really teaches about comprehensive immigration reform, there's a 2-pager on the U.S. Catholic Church's position on immigration reform. And no, the church does not support open borders. So you hear that quite often, or I read that in the news. It's like, no, they don't support them. It's very thoughtful, very reflective, very practical. So you can access all of this on the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops website. I urge you, anytime you have a question about any social issue, if you go to the, I think it's the Beliefs and Teachings as a segment, just go there. It's a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in social concerns are under human life and dignity. And you'll see there's a long list of every issue you can conceivably imagine, and what the church teaches on that particular issue. So you can go straight to the horse's mouth and see what our bishops are saying. And there's a lot of really great stuff. So, so anyway, so at this point, I'm going to introduce Stephanie. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Stephanie Delgado Garcia. She is the proud daughter of hardworking Mexican immigrants and a native of Los Angeles. She graduated cum laude from Harvard College with a BA in government, focusing her honors thesis on the relationship between the Mexican government and Mexican immigrants in the U.S. Stephanie then received her JD from Cornell Law School, where she was an acquisitions editor for Cornell Law Journal of Law and Public Policy, and participated in the labor law and LGBTQ rights clinics. After graduation, Stephanie clerked for the Honorable Michael Wilner in the Central District of California. She went on to work at a labor law firm and at Immigrant Defenders Law Center. Stephanie is now a direct representation attorney at KIND, which is Kids in Need of Defense, which I think the name was started by Angelina Jolie. That's correct. And she represents unaccompanied immigrant children in removal proceedings. Stephanie was recently stationed at the Port Isabel Detention Center in Texas, where she worked directly with separated families still in detention. So please join me in giving Stephanie a very warm welcome.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. I feel very honored to be here, able to talk to all of you about the issue that's very near and dear to my heart. But before I begin my presentation, I'm very curious about what you guys have heard about the family separation crisis. Have any of you guys read about it online, seen anything on the news, and if so, would you mind sharing?
I think one of the things, pardon me, Daniel, one of the things that I heard recently was obviously there was a decrease in numbers, and suddenly they're talking about a major increase of children again. It's a lot of confusion about them fixing the problem, addressing the problem.
Anybody else hear anything about this?
Well, I was really struck by a news report that I read of a mother who was reunited with her child, and how difficult it was for that child once he left. You know, his nightmares, his acting out, and it just brought home to me that this will go on and on for these children and families.
Anybody else?
I also heard, to go along with what you were saying, that the children don't recognize the parents in some cases, and that they're also giving the opportunity to parents who have been deported an opportunity to come back. And I'm not quite sure where that is or if that's even true.
Well, it seems like this is something that finally is so Simon Legree that the American heart does seem to be relating to this in a way that it did not relate to immigrants before.
And I heard different numbers about how many children are still not being reunited with their families. So I thought it was down to about 500, but then I saw a number of about 1,000. So I'm curious about how many children are still separated from their families.
Also, it's very confusing exactly what the conditions of the children are. You know, sometimes you hear things as horrific as, you know, they're being drugged, you know, in order to keep them calm. They're being chained sometimes in order to, you know, restrain them. So it's really hard also to know what their treatment actually has been.
What's the policy been all these years when they come across the border?
So we'll get to that. I was just
That's
curious.
a question.
I was just curious as to where everyone is coming from. But I think you had your
I was also going to mention about the medication that was allegedly given to the kids, that when they return to the family, they're not the same anymore.
Oh,
Anybody else? So as you guys can see, there's just a lot of information out there. A lot of different sources report differently. Very oftentimes they're reporting the same thing, but just from different angles. So I think because of this, there's a lot of confusion about what's actually going on at the border, what it means for separated families, what it means for children. Depending on what news outlet or person you speak to, you hear very different accounts of what's going on or what they think is going on. Even me, before I went to the border, I think I had one idea in mind, and once I got there, I was very shocked at how different things were than what I was expecting. So I wanted to, sorry, did someone say something? So I wanted to show you guys this exactly, that we're all coming from very different angles, and we've heard very different things. So please keep an open mind when you guys hear about everything that I experience and the information that I'm giving you, as well as when you guys discuss amongst yourselves the information. Sorry. So I wanted to begin first with a little context before I get into my own experiences at the border. In April 2018, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced a zero tolerance policy. What this meant was that every person crossing the border illegally would be referred for federal prosecution. That means they were going to be tried for a federal crime. A good number of these people were adults traveling with children. Oftentimes it was their children, their grandchildren, or people that they believed were their children. By law, when adults are detained and criminally prosecuted, their children cannot be housed with them in jail. Instead, kids are placed in a Department of Health and Human Services shelter until they can be released to a legal guardian. About 2,000 children were separated from adults they were traveling with across the U.S. border. The children were separated from about 1,940 adults from April 19th through May 31st as a result of the border crossing prosecutions. So this is just the context that I want you guys to keep in mind as we go forward. We'll go more into detail, but keep this in mind. Sorry about that. So as a result of this, as Cambria mentioned, I work at an organization called No worries. As Cambria mentioned, I work for an organization called Kids in Need of Defense. So we represent children, unaccompanied minors to be exact, who come to this country alone. We've been doing this for about 10 years. We were started by Angelina Jolie and a number of other people. She's a big name that people recognize. So these children came to this country alone. They come from all over, although recently they've mostly come from Central America. As part of our representation of them, we obviously take into account a number of things, their living situation, the situation of their parents, etc. When the family separation crisis hit and it started being all over the news, it occurred to my organization that these were kids that we were going to eventually represent, that this was something that we could not ignore. As a result, they started sending teams of us, both attorneys, paralegals, etc., to go to the border and try to see what was going on. We were there doing intakes, meeting with people, trying to get people connected with other providers, etc. So they sent a number of teams. Every week was a different team, and every week we saw very different challenges. You know, the first week was chaos. There was people from everywhere. There was just, nobody knew what was going on. I heard stories about like people's children being torn away while they were breastfeeding them, just like really incredible things. And every week, like I said, there were different things. I was there in late July, early August, and when I was there, with the time that the deadline was set by the federal court here in Los Angeles, that parents were supposed to be reunified with their kids. So it was a very interesting time to be there because we had seen in previous weeks some people being released, other people being denied release, DNA testing being done, and a number of problems arising out of that. For instance, one of the problems that we saw was that many people were maybe not necessarily on their children's birth certificate, so it was really hard to prove that they were their parents. Or in other instances, they were not biologically related. That doesn't make them less of a parent, as we all know, but the government had issue with that. So like I said, I went in late July, early August. Before I went, I had read a lot of things, like many of you. I'm an immigration attorney, so I thought I was pretty well versed, and I thought I knew what I was getting into. I was very wrong. Nothing prepared me for what I saw when I was there, and the amount of work that we had to do when I was there. When I was there, we were working 19 to 20-hour days. We were at the detention center all day, and the work has not stopped. To this day, I'm still in contact with a lot of families who still have a separated parent. We're still calling deported parents, but I'll get to that. I actually wanted to focus on a few, I thought, examples that were very telling of what exactly was going on. So if you guys bear with me, I will get to that. Sorry. So I was sent to Port Isabel Detention Center. That's in Harlingen, Texas, which is at the very tip of Texas, right by the Gulf. It's at the very tip. It's a detention center that's been around for a while. That was housing a lot of the parents. No children were at this detention center, so the children were at different detention centers. But most of the detained parents were either at this center or at another one called Dilly. But most of the parents, when I was there, were here at Port Isabel. for it is now housed both men and women. It's been there, I want to say, for almost 30 years. And it is not a nice place. There are snakes, it's pretty depressing, and there are immigration judges on site. It's also very hot, so I'll mention that. It's very humid, it's Texas. Most of the people who were coming did not actually try to cross in Harlingen. They tried to cross in different places, but were sent to Fort Isabel Detention Center. That was what was housing most of the parents. When I was there, I met mostly detained fathers, because a lot of the mothers had either been moved or for some reason they just were not there anymore. Some were released, some were moved, but it was mostly detained fathers, and a number of fathers came with their children alone without their mothers. And like I said earlier, I wanted to focus specifically on a number of them. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. So the first story I want to tell you is about this family from Guatemala. This family from Guatemala, the Bodenas family, they were from rural Guatemala. They're an indigenous family, and they're devout Catholics. It was a mother and a father and their 2 children. Their 6-year-old Jane and their newborn baby. They're very hardworking people. They own a cyber cafe, and the father is a teacher. They're also indigenous and speak Man, which is a rare indigenous language in Guatemala. The mother and the father speak Spanish, but the children speak very limited Spanish. They own the cyber cafe in Guatemala and were able to do this successfully for many years. The father taught at the local school and also managed the cafe with the mother. For many years, they were able to get away with this and be very fine. They never had any intention to come to the U.S. However, about 2 years ago, local gang members started extorting them. They started coming in with guns and asking them for money. They started threatening not just the mom and the dad, but the 2 children. They started telling Pedro, the father, that if he did not give them a cut of his monthly earnings, they were going to kill his daughter. That they were going to find her in her kindergarten class and kill her. At first, Pedro ignored them, but then they started coming around more frequently and pointing guns at the family, including at the newborn baby. Pedro tried to go to the police, but the police would not listen. Pedro, as an indigenous man, was ignored by the police. Oftentimes, in a lot of countries in Latin America, people who are either indigenous or of African descent are ignored or mistreated. Whenever he tried to seek help, they would call him derogatory names and ignore him. He literally had nowhere else to go. The threats kept continuing, and they kept asking for more and more and more, until one day he had to sell the cyber cafe because he could no longer manage. He had to sell the cyber cafe, and his earnings from teaching just weren't enough to sustain his family and to also pay the extortionists. Him and his wife then decided that they could no longer live in Guatemala, so they decided to come to the U.S. to seek safety for their 2 young children. Pedro's wife, Buenaventura, and their newborn son came first. Pedro, like a good father, decided to stay back an extra 2 weeks so his father could finish first grade. He didn't want to disrupt her life. He wanted her to finish the school year so that she could start a new school year in the U.S. Their plan was to come to the U.S. and to seek safety. They had heard that there was something called asylum, and that's what they wanted to do. So Pedro's wife came first, and she was detained. When Pedro came 2 weeks later, he and his young daughter, who's 6 years old, were detained. They were detained at the border, and the U.S. Border official took his daughter from him and said the following to him. She looked at the little girl and said in Spanish, "Look at this man. This is the face of a bad father. He brought you here to suffer. You are now going to go to jail because of him. I want you to remember the rest of your life that any suffering you will endure is because of this man." After that, Jane was taken to a shelter in Michigan where no one spoke Spanish, let alone Mam, the indigenous language that she spoke. She was there for several weeks. During this time, at age 6, she developed a really bad tooth infection. The tooth infection only grew worse. She stopped eating and developed a really high fever. This whole time, there was nobody who could communicate or understand Jane. She never received any medical treatment and actually almost died. Later, Jane's mother was released with her newborn son, and this is actually a video of her reuniting with them.
¿Usted va a dar conferencia? ¿Usted va a dar? Yo voy a hablar. Estoy muy feliz al recibir a mi hija, porque ella estaba muy triste al separarse de ella, pero ahorita me siento muy feliz.
Y niña, ¿tienes unas palabras del presidente de la asociación?
Es que tenga piedad de los niños, que no los separan, porque los hijos son los tesoros, el mejor regalo de Dios. Que Él tenga piedad de los niños, que no los separan, porque ella es mucho está separada de los niños. Dice que ella está feliz, pero ella me dice que ya no, nunca se quiere separar de mí. Que yo nunca, ella me dice, nunca lo permites que me quiten otra vez.
Can we save questions for the answer? So as you can see, this was very emotionally wrought. Not every case was as difficult as this one, but this definitely, I think, touched a lot of people. Buenaventura, the wife of the Godinez family, was able to reunite with her daughter, and they are now in Florida. Unfortunately, Pedro is still detained. Yeah. So Pedro is actually still detained. He's still in Texas. This family texts me every day asking me for help. He has been there over 4 months. I just got a text message on Sunday from Buenaventura saying that their children cry every day, that they just want to see their father again. I would meet with Pedro every day when I was in Port Isabel, and he actually snuck in some paper images for his daughter. He asked me to share it and to also make sure that his daughter received it. I was able to mail this to her, and for those of you who don't understand Spanish, I'm happy to translate. He drew 2 butterflies, and it says at the top, "We'll soon be together." On the bottom it says, "Family, I love you a lot and I miss you. This separation will soon end because there is a God and there are people with a big heart who help. Sincerely, Pedro." Pedro told me that when he came in, he tried to ask for asylum. He was ignored multiple times, and instead, he was actually prosecuted as a quote illegal crosser. Even though multiple times he said, "I want to seek asylum, I am afraid to go back to Guatemala, I was threatened." They claimed that they didn't understand him, that they didn't understand his Spanish, and that they definitely didn't understand any English that he might have spoken. He was never provided a translator, even though he specifically identified that he was a non-speaker and that he needed one. In the Spanish that he did know, he did ask multiple times for asylum, and every time it was denied. He was denied the opportunity to get a credible fear interview, which is part of the process, and instead, like I said, he has an illegal border crossing charge.
Did he come in a port of entry?
Yes.
And he's here illegally if he comes in a port of entry?
Well, so I'll get to that.
Okay.
Sorry. So this is one story that obviously was very touching and is still very near and dear to my heart because I'm still in touch with the family. They're in Florida. They're obviously hurting, and they obviously tried to do the right thing. I next want to get to the second story. So I don't have any pictures for this one other than this medical chart. This is the story of a family from Honduras. It's a father and a mother who were also very devout Catholics. Edwin and his wife had 3 daughters, 12, 9, and 6. The 6-year-old, Hadid, was a very nice girl. However, she had a heart condition. This is why I showed this. Hadid had a very severe heart condition. She had had multiple surgeries in the past. But unfortunately, because of the state of really bad healthcare in Honduras and the poverty, there was nothing else that could be done in the country. The next operation that Hadid needed was just not available in Honduras. There was no doctor in Honduras who could perform the heart surgery that his 6-year-old needed. They went all over, and there was nothing that could be done. It was at this point that the doctors in Honduras told Edwin that if they stayed in Honduras, his 6-year-old would die, that there was no way to get medical treatment for her anymore. Edwin then and his family then decided that they would come to the U.S. because they knew that we had better health care here. They knew that his daughter could get the heart surgery that she needed in the U.S. They came to the U.S. and they specifically said, we need help. We need help. My daughter needs heart surgery. She's 6 years old. I don't want her to die. But they were detained. Instead, Edwin's wife and his 3 daughters were detained and separated. Eventually they were let go, but Edwin was still detained for several months. Fortunately, Edwin was released. But during the time that he was detained, Edwin actually went on a hunger strike. He actually had suicidal thoughts and was in severe pain. Every day that I saw him, he would cry. He would tell me that he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his daughter and how if she didn't get this heart surgery, she would die. Every day he would ask me the same thing. Stephanie, what would you do? Would you let your daughter die and stay in Honduras, or would you come to the U.S. to get medical treatment? And he would always ask me, what do you think the rest of the U.S. would say? What parent would say, no, I'm going to let my daughter die? Edwin's daughter was able to get medical treatment, and they're now in the process of scheduling her next heart surgery. They're currently in Houston, but they're still fighting the battle. And I know it's been very, very difficult, and that his daughters have been very severely traumatized from the separation, not getting the proper medical care initially. So, hearing those stories, I wanted to talk a little bit about what led us here. Why are there all these families coming here? What is it exactly? As Cameron mentioned earlier, I'm the daughter of immigrants. My parents came here purely for economic reasons. They weren't fleeing violence. And so I think a lot of people, when they think about white immigrants are coming, and maybe specifically when they think about immigrants from Latin America, they think that they're coming for economic reasons or a plethora of other things. The reality is that the majority of people, well, at least coming from Central America, are coming here because of violence. Every single person that I met at the border was fleeing some type of violence. The 2 stories that I told you, there was violence in terms of not getting the proper medical care, there was extortion threats, there were also many other stories that I could go over my telling you. But there's just a lot of violence going on, and I personally wasn't prepared to hear so many stories of just terrible, terrible violence. And so specifically the violence that I'm talking about that's very common is domestic violence. So there's a large number specifically of women who are coming, who are fleeing their husbands, their intimate partners, and other people in their lives who have been very bad to them. There's been a lot of sexual exploitation. There's some child marriage. There's lots and lots of gang violence. There's violence towards the LGBTQ community. There's a lot of gender-based violence. There's poverty and famine, obviously natural disasters, and racial and ethnic discrimination. And I wanted to give you guys a few more examples of that. So specifically with the domestic violence and sexual exploitation, there were a lot of really young girls who were forced into marriage very young. A large number of the people coming from Central America were of indigenous background, and in a lot of indigenous communities, it's very common to marry young girls to older men, or just to marry them very young. So I saw a number of teenage girls who were coming who would tell me that they had been married for years and had young children. That to me seems crazy that a 19-year-old would have a 6-year-old son, or that a 15-year-old would have a 2-year-old. But they were saying, yeah, I was married, and my family said I had to stay with him, but he would beat me every day, and he said he was going to kill my son if I didn't listen to him, or if I didn't go to church with him, or etc. So this was a very common thing. And I also wanted to touch upon the racial and ethnic discrimination. I think it's a very common misconception that everyone in Latin America maybe is the same, that we all speak Spanish, that we all look the same, but there's a large number of different groups. So in my experience at the border, there was people that looked very different, who had very different beliefs, and who spoke very different languages. From Guatemala alone, I think who spoke 10 different languages. Very often not understanding Spanish, where we needed translators. I had people from Honduras who were of African descent who also spoke other languages, and I think that was like something that maybe people at the border weren't prepared for, because most of the time there weren't any guards or there weren't any provisions to provide people translators for them. And this was also very hard to understand why in their home countries they were treated differently than the average person. So many times the police or the government or even the schools treat indigenous or African children very differently than they do Latino or just white children, I guess you would say. They often don't get protection, and they also have very different cultural practices that can be, in some cases, harmful, like I said, younger marriages, etc. All right, so going back to the zero tolerance and family separation. So now DHS refers every individual apprehended near the border to the DOJ for criminal prosecution. So legally, anyone can go to a port of entry and ask for asylum. In practice, that doesn't always work. While I was at the border, and while my colleagues were at the border, we found that most of the people there had asked for asylum, but were never provided the means to actually seek asylum. So people would say, I want asylum, or I'm afraid to go back, and when they say that, they're supposed to be provided something called a credible fear interview, which basically you talk to an immigration officer and you explain why you're afraid to go back. If there's a chance that that you have a credible fear and that you can potentially get asylum, then you're supposed to be able to move forward with the case. Most of the people weren't provided interviews. The people who were provided interviews were very often not provided interpreters, were cut off, and were not allowed to tell their full stories. One example, for instance, is I met this 19-year-old woman who came with her 6-year-old. She had been married, and her husband in her home country had threatened to kill her son, had beat her every day of their marriage. The last straw was when he threatened her son with a knife, so she came to the U.S. This woman spoke Quiche, which is an indigenous Guatemalan language. She identified that she spoke Quiche to me after I asked, but she said that at the border they said, oh, you're from Guatemala, you speak Spanish. They never provided her an interpreter. So to the best of her knowledge, she tried to explain her situation, but was unable to, because she didn't speak Spanish. She had never gotten a proper education. The only Spanish she knew was from watching TV. She would say a few words, and I looked at the interview notes, and sure enough, the interview notes said that she was in Guatemala, and that she had a husband, and that people bullied her, so there was no credible fear. And she told me, no, I thought that I said that my husband beat me, and that he threatened to kill my son, and that he said that I had to be the same religion as him, and I had no other way out. I just want to be safe. I'm very terrified of going back because my son may die, and no one will help me. My family won't help me. And I said, unfortunately, that's not what the officer heard. But this woman tried her very best. But because she wasn't a Spanish speaker or an English speaker, she was denied that. We were eventually able to appeal it and get that reversed, but this was a very common occurrence. For a lot of people at the border, even people who were of Latino descent, just never realized or never thought to ask if they needed an interpretation in another language, or never thought to think about just the cultural implications of who they were talking to. I know a number of men said that when they identified that they spoke, for instance, Ishi or Quechua or Chortli, other indigenous languages, they were called Indios, Indians, which is a derogatory term in Latin America, or they were made fun of all the time for being short and darker by other Latinos, which they found very shocking, that people that they thought, oh, you're like me, and that the officers would be like, oh, no, I'm not like you, you're an Indio. So this was a very common occurrence, unfortunately. But moving on. So individuals apprehended at the border with their children are, in fact, de facto separated from their children and placed in detention center. So while their children are placed in different shelters. The kids are placed in RR shelters, which is, like I was saying with Jane, who ended up at an ORR shelter in Michigan. A lot of the separated kids ended up in New York. There are ORR shelters there. There's a lot of ORR shelters here in California as well, but for some reason, the separated children ended up in places like Michigan and New York. Very different than, and very far from their parents. They also didn't have, at least initially, any contact with their parents. So we found that there was a couple of issues that were going on while we were there. There was no formal way of tracking children and parents once they were separated. The government didn't think initially when they started the family separation policies of ways to track them. So for instance, think of if any of you have ever gone to Chuck E. Cheese, when you go in, they stamp your hand, and they also stamp your kid's hand. They didn't even do that. The other thing is that due to the lack of a tracking system, the number of agencies involved in detaining families, there has been no definite statistic regarding the number of families separated and reunited. So there's still some families that are separated, there's still a lot of parents that were deported, there's some parents that are here, and like I said earlier, there's also the issue of certain parents not being on birth certificates, certain parents not being biologically there, and then also there's a lot of grandparents that came, so I met definitely with a few grandparents who came with the kids, but because they weren't legally the parents, they weren't able to reunify with their grandchildren, or other people who knew and some people who didn't know that the children they were bringing with them were not biologically there, so they weren't allowed to reunify with that child. The other issue, like I mentioned earlier, is that many of the parents have been deported while their kids stay in the U.S. I've spoken to a number of them as part of the Miss L lawsuit, and many of them report that they were forced to just sign papers and didn't realize that that meant that they were never going to see their kids again, or that their kids were going to stay in the U.S. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of them are indigenous speakers, so the stuff that they were signing was either in English or in Spanish and was never translated or fully explained to them. Even when I've spoken to them with indigenous language interpreters, they're shocked to find that out. That in fact they signed away this, or that they even signed anything. So this is a recurring theme. And so, like I said, there's also a lot of myths of what's going on. There's this myth that families are quickly reunified after being released. This is actually not true. Another thing that's also not true that goes with this is that although some parents were reunified, oftentimes families that have two parents, only one parent was reunified and the other parent was either deported or is still in detention. For instance, the first family that I spoke about, the Godinez family, they, for purposes of the federal lawsuit, they're reunified, and so I had a deportation officer told me like they no longer qualify under family separation because the family unit has a mom, they don't need a dad. So this is happening a lot. Or if the child is reunited with some other family member, then they keep the parents. So say like an aunt or uncle comes forward as a legal guardian, and they will keep the parents detained. There's also this myth that children can only be detained for so long before the government must release them, and that's false. Or shelters may detain children for as long as necessary. For that reason, there's still a lot of children that are detained in places like New York and Michigan, Arizona, Texas, even some in California. So with that being said, and I'll definitely answer questions later, I wanted to now bring about this idea of how our faith calls us to respond. Like I said, many of these families were devout Catholics and very often quoted the Bible to me and would tell me, as you saw when I quoted the Bible in the video saying that children are a gift from God. So I think in that sense, that was one way that I saw it. But I think just reflecting in a larger sense about, as a Catholic, what human dignity means to me and what the Bible says about refugees and immigrants. And so I wanted to pull up some scripture for us to reflect on. I'm going to pull it up and I'm going to ask for volunteers to help me read it so you guys don't get stuck hearing my voice so much. So if someone could volunteer to read the first passage.
When an alien resides with you in your land, do not mistreat such a one. You shall treat the alien who resides with you no differently than the native born among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you too were once aliens in the land of Egypt.
Can somebody read this one?
I will, Malachi 3:5. I will draw near to you for judgment, and I will be swift to bear witness against sorcerers, adulterers, and perjurers, those who deprive a laborer of wages, oppress a widow or an orphan, or turn aside a resident alien without fearing me, says the Lord of hosts.
This is from the Old Testament and from the New Testament.
For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. A stranger, and you welcomed me.
There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free person. There is not male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus.
Sorry, this is a little longer, but I thought it was a good one. We don't have to read it out loud. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. I will ask you to read it and just think about, based on these passages, and even thinking about Christ himself and his family and how they themselves were refugees, what this means, hearing these stories and thinking about these families that are coming here, fleeing violence, persecution, and other terrible things. For me, the work that I do is very personal because of my familial history, but also because of the Catholic I find that God and Jesus call me to serve Him. The way that I see myself serving them is by helping people who cannot help themselves. And that I see as my role as a Catholic in doing immigration and doing immigration for children because I see them as the most vulnerable. And I often think about these specific passages and think about just the work that I'm doing. And how in my mind, and you may disagree, I think that I'm trying to carry out his word. And so with that in mind, I want you guys to think about whatever it is that you thought about the family separation crisis, and maybe immigrants, you may know some immigrants, you may not. You may have heard things, you may have certain opinions, maybe negative. You may be worried about the fiscal implications of having immigrants in this country. And I would invite you to square that with what these passages say and what your understanding of our faith is. And as you all know, the Conference of Catholic Bishops was very vocal in opposing the family separation crisis, I think for this very reason. They definitely, as I mentioned, quoted the same line that when I quoted in the video, the children are a gift from the Lord, the fruit of the womb is the Lord. I thought that was very telling, and I hadn't realized that they used the same quote until I rewatched the video and preparing for tonight. As you know, the Conference of Catholic Bishops is very, very vocal. They very much oppose anything of the children. I won't bore you with reading everything, but I think you guys also have a copy of the statement. The Pope himself has also agreed with the SCCD. And he's tweeted actually specifically addressing the plight of refugees and immigrants. He said, "We encounter Jesus and those who are poor, rejected, or refugees. Do not let fear get in the way of welcoming your neighbor in need." He also said, "A person's dignity does not depend on them being a citizen, a migrant, or a refugee. Saving the life of someone fleeing war and poverty is an act of humanity." I also wanted to talk a little bit about how you can volunteer if you're interested in volunteering and donating before we get into our discussion. If any of you are attorneys, I definitely encourage you to take a case and help a child in their immigration proceedings. A large number of the separated families that were released and are pursuing their asylum claims have come to the Los Angeles area and need all the help they can get. If you speak any other languages, you can serve as an interpreter or translator in settings like client meetings, intakes, or asylum interviews. If you'd like to donate, you are more than welcome to. And if you want to donate not just money, there's a number of things that are needed. Like I said, a lot of these families don't have very much. Kids need school supplies, they need diapers, etc. So from toys to toiletries, donations involving children's necessities are greatly appreciated. There's a lot of these separated families that are here. They come into our office all the time, and they need as much as they can get. So if you are interested in volunteering or donating, I'm more than happy to talk to you about that after the program as well. So I came up with a few discussion questions based on what we talked about initially when I asked about what you had heard and what I've talked about. So the first one is, what did you learn from the presentation? Was the information provided different or similar to what you've heard and seen on the news? How did the Catholic Church's teachings on human dignity affect the way you see the family separation crisis at the border? And what do you think your role as a Catholic is in responding to the family separation crisis?
Thank you, Cynthia. So I think we have a moment to take a few questions before we break out into groups. Would you like to do that?
Credible fear interviews stopped with the advent of the zero tolerance, is that correct?
No. So credible fear interviews are still supposed to be conducted. The thing is that they're not always conducted, and when they are, there's a lot of irregularities. So people can say they want asylum, which entitles them to a credible fear interview, or in some instances something called a reasonable fear interview, if people have tried to come in the past. However, as I mentioned earlier, people who were asking for asylum, that was never taken down, and so they weren't provided interviews. And if they weren't provided translators, they weren't provided culturally competent officers, etc.
If I may just follow
Sorry,
up.
go ahead.
My impression is that the administration wanted to use separation as a weapon. Is that just my imagining, or is there substance to that?
I can't speak for the administration, but I can say that it was used. I think it was intended to be as like to deter people from coming, but that's the way that it was imagined.
That's what I thought.
The asylum request, that's an international law that we've signed on to, right?
That's correct.
It's not something that's just an American thing, it's
No.
an international law that we've agreed to.
Yeah, exactly. So everyone in the entire world is entitled to seek asylum in the U.S., and you can also seek asylum at any point. So you can be living in the U.S. for years, be a legal resident, and then decide you want to seek asylum, you're allowed to do that.
But we can seek asylum somewhere else, too.
Yes, exactly.
So, I mean, it's an international law that we're...
Yeah, for the UN. Sorry.
How do they sustain themselves here once they're released?
So there's a number of them who have family members who are helping them. There's also a number of like different organizations that help them, different nonprofits like Raíces in Texas, who give them, and there's a number of like corporations that are also donating. For instance, right now, Uber has donated very generously to organizations like Kind, so we're able to give them order Uber Eats for free for our clients at any point. So my clients have been asking, for instance, for pizza and burgers every day.
So I just want to validate, so it's not like, and I'm showing my age here, like when the Vietnamese came over, we were actually subsidizing them as a government. It's nothing like that. They're being subsidized through private donations. Good. Okay.
And to follow up, what's their status once they leave?
So they are still undocumented. They're still fighting their cases. They're in removal proceedings. So they have to find attorneys or somebody to help them move forward with their asylum applications, or maybe if there's some other type of relief that they can potentially qualify for. But it's usually asylum that they're seeking. Yes.
Before April, what were they doing with families that came across the border?
So before April, families that came across the border, they expressed a fear. They were released and able to seek out their asylum case in immigration court.
Not gonna like just on bail, like you still have to
Yeah.
additional facing prosecution.
Yes,
but
exactly.
You're still allowed to do it. With
Not
the family
detained,
members.
yeah. There was also family detention centers, which there still are at Philly. And I remember someone asking previously about the condition of children. So depending on the facility where the children were housed, there was a lot of rampant human rights abuses. So I did have a few parents tell me that their kids were given medications against their will. I know there was at least one shelter where sexual assault was reported.
I hear about that.
In Arizona. So I think you can't generalize because every shelter was different, and clearly they were like that before in some and not others. But there was some really troubling instances, and then there was also just a lot of neglect, like the case that I mentioned earlier, where there weren't people who were able to communicate with their children, or maybe didn't have an interest in figuring out why the child wasn't eating, or if the child was in pain, etc. Sorry.
Is there, are there any people in these shelters for the children who have any background in working with children? Or is it just like prison guard and what is
So each shelter for children is different. Some are state-run, some are private companies. They're supposed to hire people who have background checks and the experience, but that doesn't always happen. And even so, that people slip up. Like I mentioned, we know several instances of sexual assault happening in Arizona shelters for the children. In fact, I had a client who was previously sexually assaulted at a shelter. This is unfortunately not an uncommon thing.
And am I right in saying that the contracts for these providing these services run into the millions and maybe even some cases millions of dollars, or the other one? Yeah, hundreds of millions of dollars, I should say, for some of these contractors.
That is correct. And, I don't want to say that every single shelter is terrible and, abusing children, but there's definitely not a lot of oversight in the shelters, which I think leads to a lot of bad things happening sooner or later.
In court, you mentioned that there were judges that were stationed there. Was that for expeditious purposes of
Yes.
getting them sent back, or for what purpose?
Yeah, so the judges were there exactly for that reason, to get them just expedited out. And it wasn't just a team of parents, it was a team. So I got to observe several hearings with the different judges, and it really ran the gamut. There were some judges who were very mindful of what was going on, and were throwing out like negative credible peer interviews, or like requiring credible peer interviews. And there were other judges who I think were on like the New York Times and CNN. Somebody reported them just like cursing at people and just telling them to get out. There were also a lot of instances where I saw people ask the immigration judge for an interpreter for an indigenous language, and the judge just deny it or ignore it, or tell them that it was too hard to get a chair, a or short the interpreter. And if they understood any Spanish, it was enough for them.
Follow-up, because that court seems really, or that detention facility seems very far and isolated to be able to get translators with that. I mean, do you think we didn't have big space?
So you can get translators over the phone fairly easily. There's a number of different organizations that provide phone translation. So there's Mayan interpreters, specifically, for instance, specializes in indigenous languages from Guatemala. There's Pacific interpreters. There's a large number. Like when I was there, I used phone interpreters.
And you're mentioning it was very hot, and we were going to say something more to that later. So.
Yeah, so it was very, very hot there. And so for a lot of the people, they were also suffering as a result of the heat and not getting water or only getting certain meals. And then the hunger strikes were particularly bad because of the heat. Every one of the men that I was talking about, he refused to eat because he was so worried about his daughter and in protest. And he had to go to the infirmary a couple of times. I think at one point he did save his lunch and ate a little bit of it, but for most of it, the heat really, whenever people wanted to protest, I think it was a lot harder.
Is it an important distinction between the term immigrant and refugee? Does it have any meaning in what we do?
Yeah, so a refugee is someone who is seeking refuge, someone who's seeking safety, and an immigrant is any person who's not from this country. So I would classify most of these people, or everyone that I met at least, as a refugee, because they were all seeking refuge, safety. But an immigrant would be, for instance, someone who's coming here for economic reasons or for school, something like that.
and I'm sure you have more questions, but I think it's time for us to kind of maybe convene into our small groups, and then we'll be able to come back for another few minutes at the end. We might generate some more questions. So we need to have 6 tables, so I was just wondering if maybe the folks at, maybe these, and Sam, do you want to be part of the, Sam is Stephanie's husband, by the way. So so I don't know if you want to maybe have 4 at this table over here and 5 here, and then how do you want to do it? So we have 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tables, because we have 6 facilitators. And those of you who are facilitators, if you can make sure that you're over the table.
We have really good work here.
Now, there are no questions.
Well, they need a facilitator there, I think. Yeah.
Restroom? Okay. We'll wait for you.
Potty break.
Yeah.
Like that is really needed. I mean, like you said, the ongoing children's class.
And you said if there's a ministry that you think the organization exists.
That's what I think.
So the
Okay, we'll come back together.
Everybody's
The kids who come alone, a lot of them are in shelters. Some of them will be reunited with family members, whether it's potentially a parent who's here, a cousin, an uncle, a grandparent, a close family friend, a godparent. Some of them are taken into foster care. Some of them remain in shelters. And some of them, once they turn 18, get placed back in detention for deportation. Are there any other questions?
Did you have any experience with individuals? Because I oftentimes hear that, there's also a myth that all refugees and asylum seekers are Latin American, but the fact is that we have many coming from other parts of the world as well. Can you speak to that at all from your experience?
Yeah, so when I was at Port Isabel, everyone that I saw was from Latin America, but within the people from Latin America, there were different, there was Afro-Latinos, indigenous Latinos, mixed-race Latinos, but as someone who represents children in immigration proceedings, I have clients from other countries. I had a number of clients from Ghana, for instance. So a lot of children coming from Ghana who made this incredible journey, went from Ghana to Brazil, and just it took them 2 years to get to the U.S., but they finally got here. So I think there's all kinds of stories like that. In fact, one of my Ghanaian clients, he had this incredible story where he grew up in a Muslim household. He converted to Catholicism, in fact, and his father tried to kill him for it. So he made the 2-year trek to come to the U.S. And he was able to get here, and is now here, doing a lot better, able to practice his faith. But it took him 2 years to get here, and he was detained for a long time. He was homeless. It was incredibly difficult for him, and also because he was Ghanaian and he wasn't Latino, there was a lot of doors that were closed for him. And it was also very hard, I think, for people to understand, because when they think of immigration, they think, as you were saying, that it's going to be a Latino or that they're going to look a certain way.
When you were in Texas, did you see in the staff, any of the staff who were maybe a little short on compassion or?
Sounds like a lot of them.
Yeah, so it's funny because of the people who work at the detention centers, the ones who face the public, are very different than the ones who interact with people. So all the ones that I was dealing with were incredibly nice, giving me restaurant recommendations, nicknames, etc. But they were very different than the ones that were talking to the people. Because I remember talking to them and then telling me these horror stories about the racial epithets and all that, and I'd be like, which one is he? Show me. And they're like, oh no, they keep them in the back because they wanted to keep on this image of oh, we be good to them. But yeah, I didn't personally meet any of them, but I know they were there, just not interacting. I think with the lawyers or the media.
Well, I have to say that this looks like it would be in a third world country. but this is in America, and I'm an American, and this is awful.
It is.
Well, how does this happen in America in this day and age? And nobody's doing anything about it, really. I mean,
I don't think it's anything new in our history. It's not just in this day and age.
Well, that's probably true, but it's happening right now.
But they're not doing it anymore. It's over. They're not doing it anymore.
They're not doing,
Separating children from families.
yeah, but still, the conditions, this is, the problem is not solved.
No, it's a big problem.
It doesn't mean.
They're not actually separating new families, but there's still a lot of separated families out there, and there's still a lot of children who are in shelters and
What are
with
they
parents.
doing with those families that they're not separated?
So they're giving them credible fear interviews, and then potentially, if they pass a credible fear interview, they can pursue their asylum case outside of detention.
But they're also talking about, aren't they talking about this in Flores?
Yeah.
So you might mention.
So there's this big lawsuit that came out about all the Flores settlement that says that children can be detained. So they're talking about changing the rules. The Trump administration is talking about changing that and just being tougher on immigration, whatever that means in this country.
So they may lock the families up.
Indefinitely.
All be detained indefinitely.
But that was a court settlement. The administration cannot do it unilaterally.
That doesn't mean they won't pay.
Oh, no, I get that. But they cannot do it unilaterally.
Have they, I mean, and this has nothing to do with actually this specific topic, but, you know, immigrants have a huge economic impact on us. I mean, we make money on them. And then we also have the replacement issue where there's not enough of us to, you know, pay the tax base as we retire. We really need the immigrants. I mean, I'm surprised that hasn't been brought forth. That type of, I mean, it's money. I mean, and they do a lot. They do a lot for
People
this
in power
country.
don't want to hear that. They deny it. It's not the case. They just suck off of the rest of us.
And also, if you keep them as a second class, then it makes the labor pool cheaper too, and a lot of corporations benefit. So there's that issue too that comes up in the immigrants.
I'm an immigrant. I'm originally from Ghana, but I went to law school in the U.S. So the picture of what an immigrant is, it's like you're saying the immigrant, but I'm American and I'm Ghanaian. I was educated in the U.S. and I've lived in Ghana, so an immigrant can be a very complex picture, and it's not just that person coming out of the border. I just wanted to comment.
And by the way, I'm an immigrant.
Yeah.
I'm an immigrant. I was born in Bermuda. My parents are English. I'm British citizenship, but I came here on a work visa and then got through to a green card, and I got my citizenship about 8 years ago. So I also
Yeah. So not everything.
But it was very hard.
Yeah.
We're talking, but it's a very complex.
Exactly, and like I mentioned, I had a number of Canadian clients, and they had their own set of issues.
Yeah.
Here we are. There's a lot to be disappointed about if you're having like working for success stories or stuff.
So I think for me it was very exciting. The father whose daughter had the heart condition that he was finally released, and he actually texted me 2 days ago with a prayer and a picture of his daughters in their school uniform. They were in the same school. So that was really wonderful. And the other one was the 19-year-old that I was talking about, who was an indigenous language speaker and was never provided an interpreter. You know, I wrote this big thing about how she needed to be provided an interpreter and how she needed to get another interview but with an interpreter. And funny enough, the government, instead of saying, like, we'll provide an interpreter, just reversed it and gave her a positive finding. Instead of like, well, it was funny because they were like, oh no, providing an interpreter is too much work, we'll just run it. Probably that.
I'm going to invite Jane to come up and close with a prayer. And then, Stephanie, thank you so much. You're welcome to stay and
I'll be around.
The conversation, but that was really wonderful.
So interesting.
prayer. Loving God, you create every person in your image and unite us all in one human family. As our brothers and sisters keepers, fill us with courage and compassion, that we might meet the hardships of migrants and refugees, not with silence and indifference, but with generous acts of mercy, welcoming every stranger as Christ in our midst. Amen.
Amen. And then when we did talk about, in terms of actually doing something concrete to help our sisters and brothers here in Los Angeles, that maybe doing some kind of a drive or something.
Yeah, we're going to talk to Stephanie, and please keep your eyes out for the sign at the back of the church and on the side.
So I know we can be very generous from Holy Family, and at least in a very practical way, help support some of these families.
Do you have a sign-up sheet? People would like to be on the list?
Yes, so there is a sign-up sheet out there, right?
Oh, right.
Yeah. So if you'd like to hear about more, not just about this topic, but about social concerns, presentations, we can add you to a mailing list and let you know when we're doing the next activity or event.